I'm talking about my hard drive, and I'm first giving you a short overview of the talk. So first, mandatory introduction, who I am, what a hard drive is, and so on. Then we're going to see the firmware reverse engineering of this drive, how I injected a backdoor, how you can afterwards remotely access this backdoor through network without modifying the software that is running on the computer where the hard drive is plugged into. Then we're going to discuss several advantages, disadvantages of a hard drive backdoor. And finally, I'm going to conclude this talk. Okay. So, about myself. I'm a PhD candidate at REcon, a small research institute in the south of France. And you have the link to my website on the slides. You can check my publications, especially the publication that was the basis of this talk is also there. And currently I'm working on two projects, mainly. One is Avatar. It's very similar to the talk of Panda that you have heard before. And Avatar is meant to emulate firmwares by forwarding memory accesses between an emulator and a real device. And the other project I'm currently working on is a firmware mass survey, where we just download a bunch of firmwares from the internet and see what's inside. I would like to thank several persons for this work. First, my advisors, Davide Balzarotti and Aurélien Francillon, who enabled me to work on this. Then Travis Goodspeed. I don't know if Travis is still here, but he started this work, and he gave me the hard drive. And all the other authors of the paper, Anil, Travis, Motrahi, Davide, Aurélien, Eric, and Jonas, for the great research. Okay, so why do we want to backdoor hardware? Let's look at this computer, and you see you have loads of components. You have a keyboard that has a keyboard controller. You have a display. You have a touchpad, a hard disk, Northbridge chipset, GPU, and many, many others. And all of these components have in common that they have their own processor and they run their own software. Most of the times it's not in the architecture of the main processor, so it's not x86, but ARM or something else. And all of this code that is running on those devices is part of the trusted computing base. So if you manage to modify the code in one component and to compromise it, then the trusted computing base of the whole computer is compromised. So, yeah, why a firmware attack? Well, the first thing I already said, firmware attack can compromise the trusted computing base and can give you access to the resources of computer. But also firmware infections are really hard to find. I don't really know any product that is able to find a firmware infection right now. And they're really, really hard to remove or even impossible to remove. And the other question, why would you backdoor a hard drive? A hard drive is quite interesting in a computer because all the persistent information is stored there. So if you want to get access to bank account details, secret documents, anything else, password files, it's all stored on the hard drive. And third question is, how can such a backdoor be accessed? And this I'm going to show here. So the goals of this talk is to show that you can compromise the firmware of a common off-the-shelf disk, that you can design a backdoor that exfiltrates data from this disk. I'm going to evaluate the performance and impact of the backdoor I wrote, and finally discuss some countermeasures that you can take to prevent such attacks. Before I dive too deep in, I want to say that there has been another work done by Jeroen Domborg, and this was presented at Observe HackMake 2013. He used a different hard drive brand, Western Digital, if I'm not mistaken. And he was a bit more lucky than me because he got JTAG debugging running on his drive. He has a really nice blog post on his work, so if you're more interested in hard drive hacking, this is also a good read. And we too were not the only persons to do that. There was also somebody else doing that before. So this was quite funny because I heard this year around the CCC that the NSA is using exactly this technique to attack hard drive firmwares. And I'm going to explain a little bit more how my backdoor relates to what the NSA did. Okay, so what is a hard drive? Here you see a photo of the first hard drive, the IBM 350. And this one was still quite bulky. Today, hard drives look more like the thing there. And they were composed of magnetic disks. And on these magnetic disks, you have read heads that are flying on a thin air cushion. And while the disks are spinning, they're inducing an analog current in the head. Then afterwards, this analog current is decoded to a digital signal. And this gives you back your data. So a hard drive is composed of the spinning motor that spins the disk. You have the servo motor that controls the head. And you have the analog data stream that is decoded. And because this is quite complicated, manufacturers quite early changed the disk design to not forward all these signals to the PC and process them there anymore, but they put a small microcontroller on the disk, which took over all these tasks. This is what we call integrated disk electronics. And the typical hard drive firmware runs on a microprocessor. This can be ARM, MIPS, something else. It can be reprogrammed. It's stored on a flash chip on the drive or on the disk. Since you need to get the disk running and the hard disk is quite complicated and has a lot of parameters that you need to respect when you want to read from it, all the drives have at least one flash chip that is that contains the initial firmware that is then used to spin up the disk. And it has several tasks. It decodes the ATA protocol. This is the protocol that the PC speaks with the hard drive. It translates the logical block addressing to the cylinder head sector addressing. I don't know, people who are older than me probably still remember that you had to set cylinder head sector settings in the BIOS for DOS. Fortunately, now hard drives are addressed as a linear addressing space. And the firmware is hiding all this complexity. And the firmware coordinates all these motors and so on that are on the drive. Okay, so this was enough for knowing what a hard drive is, so let's look at the firmware. Well, here you see my second prototype of the system. I had built a relay to switch the hard drive on and off by USB. Now I've changed the design a bit and use a much easier system. I have a switchable power supply. By the way, if you see network Belkin Wemo, please don't hack it. I need it for the demonstration, and I know it's open and it's easily accessible, but don't switch my hard drive on and off, please. Okay, then there is a USB serial converter. This is used to attach to a serial port that is exposed by the hard drive. And finally, a USB SATA bridge that talks to the SATA port of the drive. So when I started the work, I was looking at the firmware update files because this is the first resource you can get on the drive. But unfortunately, they turned out to be not very straightforward to reverse. If at the end there's a bit time, I'm going to explain a bit more because now I reversed the file format with the knowledge I got from the firmware. But this was more or less a dead end in the beginning. Also, on the PCB, there was a JTAG pinout, and we managed to connect the JTAG to that, but it just showed the initial ID, and afterwards, when OpenOCD tried to read memory, it didn't give us any more. So most probably you need to read at a secret location before to unlock it. So it was also a dead end. But finally, there are the master-slave jumpers on this drive, and if you connect a serial port to that, then you can actually get a nice diagnostic menu. The menu looks somehow like this. You see there are loads of commands, and they even put a nice online help for that. Most of the commands are quite boring. They're used to calibrate the disk, to format the disk, to set internal parameters. But there are some commands that look quite interesting, like peak memory byte, peak memory word, and firmware reset. So, yeah, what can you do with that? Well, Travis was kind enough to write a Python script that can extract the firmware with this. And the only problem is that if you access an invalid address on the drive, it will crash. So it needs some trial and error and a lot of rebooting to get the whole firmware. But still, you don't have code execution with that. You could now go and analyze the firmware, find code flow, and then inject some code in this code flow to get control. But this was a bit too complicated, so I looked further. And if you press Ctrl-C and you reboot the drive, you go to this menu. And this menu is much simpler. It has commands like ds, which stand for data send, and you can send a Motorola S-record file. Terminal echo changes the way the menu responds, and so on. And there are also some nice commands like ap, which is set address pointer, wr, which is write a byte to memory, rd, which is read a byte from memory, and go, which is execute the address pointer. So perfect code execution. And from the disassembly of this bootloader, I was also able to get getC and putC functions, so I had input and output. And this led to the development of a tiny GDB stub that then can be injected through this bootloader menu, and which I wanted to use to debug the firmware later. Okay, the GDB stub is really simple. It uses the GDB remote protocol. It's absolutely no wizardry. And the amazing thing is that you need to implement only 6 primitives to make GDB work, which is read-write memory, read-write registers, and continue and get signal. I didn't use GDB's implementation because first, it was not for ARM, and second, it's quite big. And I needed something small since I was reprogramming the bootloader quite often. So next step is to gather some information on this processor. This can be done with the CPU ID instruction on ARM, and also you can use code processor instructions to get information about if a debug unit is installed and if it's enabled. In my case, it was disabled. If the caching is active, and so on and so on. Another thing I needed to do was reconstruct the memory map of this drive. Some memory regions I already knew from the firmware dump before, and also I knew that the serial port was in the I/O memory region, but I completed this memory map. And finally, I also wanted to dump the contents of the flash chip. And for this, I was really lazy. I just set the breakpoint at the beginning of the flash read function, waited till it dropped there, changed the parameters to read the whole flash into RAM, and then afterwards put a breakpoint at the end of the function and dump the RAM when it was there. The memory map I got looks like this. You have some SRAM chip. You have the ROM code that is executed in the beginning. You have the dynamic RAM, which is initialized later and is actually the buffer space of the drive. The drive manufacturer is cheating a bit because it's also using this dynamic RAM to store the firmware while it's running. So the buffer space you have available for your hard drive is actually a bit less. So during the boot process of the drive, you have the ROM bootloader. This one was the one with the small menu you saw before. This loads the next stage from flash memory. You have a flash bootloader, which is a stripped down firmware of the hard drive. It's just enough to set up all the hardware devices that are inside. The dynamic RAM, it sets up memory protection, and it loads the main firmware from the disk. Then the main firmware handles all the normal disk operation. In addition to the flash bootloader firmware, it has also the protocol part with SATA. And you have something very interesting, that is overlays. These are kind of plugins to the main firmware that can be used to implement additional function. For example, the big diagnostic menu with several hundred commands. Or it can also be used by OEMs to customize the hard drive. So while going through all these stages, I had some small problems with my software debugger, because software debugging is quite fragile, so you need to be careful that the exception vectors don't get overwritten, otherwise you lose control. And this happens several times when you switch from one firmware to the other. Also, you need to be careful to not have memory protection, because this will prevent you from setting breakpoints. And finally, the problem during those stages is that the memory layout changes quite drastically. So in the beginning, I had my stub in the SRAM, but I needed to move it to DRAM afterwards because the main firmware was using the whole SRAM. And there's also no external debugging input. But for this, I found a quite nice trick. I just put a breakpoint in the serial port interrupt so that I could just send the character to the drive and have my debugger back. Yeah, this was my first really big hardware reversing project, and it turned out to be quite hard because there were no strings in the firmware. There were, of course, no known APIs because there's no operating system in traditional sense. Then the software debugger cannot send watch points, so it's really hard to follow data. And in addition to that, the firmware uses global variables excessively, which makes it really hard to trace when data is accessed. And finally, you have also lots of function pointer tables, which is not very nice with IDA's auto analysis because IDA is not able to recover that these are function pointers, and you need to find all those tables yourself and mark them. So yeah, I said there is no operating system. This is not completely correct. They have a kind of operating system inside, but it's very small. It's a real-time operating system with a simple scheduler. You have a fixed number of tasks. It's event-based. You have each task has an event mask that it can set. And when you transfer control to another task, you can send an event. It's also preemptive, so tasks can be changed after interrupts, and it works mostly cooperative, so tasks change by yielding to another. So then the next step was to look at how ATA commands are handled in the firmware. For this, it's quite handy to have something to send ATA commands, to be able to directly send ATA commands, and Linux doesn't allow you this very easily. You have the SCSI layer in between and so on. So this is not very nice. And I found a nice solution for that, which is this USB SATA bridge that I'm using. I can use a small libUSB driver to control this bridge, and then I can send raw ATA commands. And also it has the advantage that Linux doesn't crash every time that there is a SATA timeout, and then afterwards doesn't allow me to use this port anymore. So when you trigger a SATA read command, it looks like that you pass through several tasks. First, the command arrives, and you handle an interrupt for that. Then it passes control to the SATA task, which will ask the cache task, is this block already there in the cache? If so, the cache task passes it back directly. Otherwise, it goes to the read-write task, which then loads the block from disk, puts it back to the cache task, and the cache task notifies the SATA task, hey, now is the block, I have the block. And the SATA task replies to the computer, here's the block. So when I did this work, I didn't have Avatar yet. Afterwards, I created the Avatar framework to make this analysis easier and to record traces of the execution. But as it turned out, this is still tricky because the trace I got is not identical to what is really executed on the hard drive. This is mostly because the timing is really destroyed if you use Avatar to record traces. So, let's look at the backdoor. So my first hunch for hooking the backdoor was to just find in the write flow where the data passes through and is then passed to the read-write task. And I hooked the first backdoor between the cache and the read-write task, not so much out of any practical considerations, but because this was the first point where I found the data. The problem with the hard drive is that the data passes through the firmware basically without being referenced. First, the firmware has three different ways to reference to data. So either directly as a memory pointer, but also as a block in memory, which uses different addressing, and a pointer that is relative to an offset. So it was quite complicated to just find the data. Then I wanted to modify some data as it passed through, but also this turned out to be quite tricky because data is protected by checksums. 16-bit checksum and a 32-bit checksum. Quite weird design to have two checksums like that. But both were quite weak, and the checksumming code was contained in firmware, so I was able to reverse them. But finally, I decided for a much simpler solution. So I'm just hooking in the right path, and I scan for magic commands inside the data that's coming in. If such a command is detected, then the LBA that you want to read, that you instruct to read in this command, is stored in memory. And the second hook in the read path is just checking if the block that you're reading is at the logical block where you wrote before. And if so, it replaces the block address of the block you want to load with the one from the backdoor, and then returns you this block. Okay, this was a bit confusing. This is why I have it in graphics again. So we are sending a command, write logical block 4567 to the drive. And this block actually contains the backdoor command. And the backdoor command says read block 1234. This goes to the hard drive. The backdoor scans the block contents and realizes that there is a backdoor command and stores this in memory. And when you send a read command next time for logical block 4567, which is exactly the block where you wrote before, so it means if you, for example, edited the text file, then you can get back the contents of the text file. Then the hard drive will return you the contents of 1234. So this is good to circumvent operating system access restrictions. So far for injecting the backdoor. Then the last step is to make the backdoor permanent. For this, I reversed the firmware update file format further, and I was able to put at least my GDB stub in the plugin section. Now I've done some more reversing work, and I'm pretty sure I can put the backdoor permanently in the hard drive. If you run on a PC, you can also use programs like HDParm to actually program the drive while the PC is running. So you don't even need to have a shutdown cycle to program the drive. And once the firmware is installed, it can it can do as firmware has been updated when you try to update next time and stay permanent. Or it can even burn a fuse on the flash chip so that you cannot reprogram the flash chip anymore. So then you can make the backdoor really permanent on the drive. And the only solution to get rid of the backdoor drive is to more or less throw it away. So far, this was not too special. I just hacked the drive and I inserted the backdoor. But the part that is amazing is that you can actually access this backdoor without modifying the operating system of the computer where the drive is in. Let's look at this scenario. So here you have a database server that contains our drive, and you have a user that is accessing the database servers through a firewall, typical internet architecture. If this user is now malicious and manages to infect this drive, for example, by renting a dedicated server from a cloud provider, putting the backdoor on the drive while he is root, and then afterwards giving the server back, then he wants to access this malicious drive now. So let's look at how he can do this. So he's sending the backdoor command. The backdoor command is composed of a magic value and the command. In our case, the command is simply the logical block address that we want to read. And if you just send one block like this, the problem is that if you pass the data over internet and so on, it's not aligned to block boundaries of the hard drive anymore. So in the end, if you just check one part of the block and if you don't scan the whole block in the drive, then you will not see the backdoor command. It's not good to scan the whole block inside the hard drive, because this will have performance penalties if you scan all the data that is coming through. So you just want to check several bytes in the block. But what you can actually do is you can put several magic values, and once you detect a run of 512 bytes that is enough to put sector there, then you can then you can insert the data in this part. So there are several things you can do to make this more robust. If you pass data over the internet, then you can encode the data base 64. It means you need to have a longer run, not 512 bytes anymore, but 763 to insert the data. But like this, you can protect it against anything that comes afterwards and garbles the data. Also, caching is a bit challenging. Linux is using something that is called page cache. This is a cache for all block devices, and it's quite big. So a normal system is several gigabytes. So when you want to read data again, Linux is actually not reading the data from the disk, but is reading from the page cache. So you need to wait until your page is evicted from this page cache. You can do this either by waiting really long or by creating a lot of traffic so that the page cache gets flushed. The experiment we did looked like this. You have the hard drive plugged to a computer. On the computer is running MySQL setup with an Apache server and a PHP-based forum. And somebody is accessing this forum and is able to write forum posts, which are then get written to the database, are stored on the disk. On the disk, the backdoor reads the commands that are put in those posts. And afterwards, the data is passed back when the forum is accessed again. So by using this architecture, you can mount this hard drive in Python. And you can... this mounting works just by always sending backdoor commands, getting the block back, and then reading this block. And if you do this continuously and you follow the file system, so first you read the master boot record in block 0 to see the partition layout. Then you read the first partition and you check what the file system is. You go on until you find an X3 partition. Then you read the X3 superblock. And you go through etc until you reach etc shadow. Then you are able to exfiltrate a file etc shadow in 9 queries. And in our experiment, this took less than 1 minute. Of course, if you want to do this in real life, then you're not generating this amount of traffic that we generated in that case. So it will maybe take 1 day, but still afterwards you have root access to this PC once you manage to crack the hash inside this file. And etc shadow is not the only information you can access. So, of course, there are some limitations. First, the backdoor commands all need to pass through the block cache. So it means that the throughput is severely limited. And second, if you have a RAID system, then the hard drive has only a partial view of the stored data. If you have RAID 5 and you use striping, then the hard drive will only see some blocks and not all of the blocks of the data you write. So then, then you cannot access all the information anymore. And finally, also software encryption defeats the backdoor, because if the blocks get encrypted, then afterwards the hard drive cannot recognize the backdoor command anymore. You could go around those limitations by infecting the operating system that is running on the host. This can be done by injecting code, for example, in the master boot record, or by identifying when a bootloader is loaded, like the NT LDR or grub, and then infecting this code. Or by detecting dynamic link library loads and infecting dynamic libraries. This helps to circumvent software encryption, because if you manage to infect the kernel module or the kernel, and you're inside the kernel, then software encryption doesn't help anymore. It also helps against the low throughput, because once you're running inside the system, then you can directly use the network card, and you can send with much higher throughput. But of course, it's less stealthy if you infect the main system, because then you're exposed to the normal scanning. So what the NSA actually did at least from what I found, is that they install rootkits on a PC through other systems. So they have, I forgot the name of the system they're using, but once they have remote access to your PC, they will use a hard drive backdoor to make their rootkit permanent. And even if you format the hard drive, you will get back the malicious master boot record they installed afterwards, and this one will infect your Windows system again. So even if you try everything that is normally recommended, like formatting the drive, removing all the data, then this backdoor is still persistent. Okay, another question that people ask me is, yeah, okay, you have this backdoor, but it's quite hard to write this backdoor, and there are many hard drive vendors. So here you see a market share of hard drive vendors in Q3 2011. But then there was a flood in Thailand, and how the market actually looks like more is like that. And you can see there is Seagate that has quite a lot of market share. There's Western Digital and Toshiba. And me, I looked at Seagate Drive, and Sprite TM looked at Western Digital. And you can see that basically all the hard drive market is backdoored. So specific things you can do against a hard drive backdoor is host level detection. You could, for example, sporadically read blocks again once you wrote them to the hard drive to check that they're still the same. I think this is one of the features that is also in BTRFS. So future file systems might protect you against such modifications. You could also try network level detection. If you know the backdoor command, then you can find it on the network level. But then this is most likely going to be used as a targeted attack, so you don't know exactly which backdoor command is going to be used against you, and network detection is going to be quite hard. What would also help is using software encryption, at least if the master boot record is not, if this backdoor is not infecting the master boot record. And it would be important to verify the system integrity to see that the operating system has not been tampered with, so that there is no master boot record rootkit. In general, for embedded systems, you should have firmware integrity. So you can achieve this by signing the firmware and starting from a root of trust, like the ROM bootloader in this drive. But it doesn't help you against several attacks, like code injection or return-oriented programming. And it's also very difficult to realize firmware integrity with the plug-in model that is inside this hard drive. If other people are allowed to load code inside your execution system, then you would need to check these signatures too, and then it gets more difficult because then you need to have a certificate authority, and this is most probably above the head for just a hard drive. Solution would also be to have remote attestation to prove that the firmware has not been tampered with against the host, but I think this is still area of research. And what would also help is to have better firmware analysis tools, so tools that can do static binary analysis, dynamic analysis of firmware, and emulation. And it would be quite nice to establish some minimum security standards for firmware. For example, a scanner where you can just throw in your firmware and it shows you if this firmware at least doesn't have something like worst practices. So I presented you a firmware attack. This was that can be used to exfiltrate data. And the amazing thing about this attack is that you don't need to modify any PC code, but you just use a side channel to exfiltrate the data. And the attack is almost impossible to detect, except if you know the backdoor command and you are observing exactly this backdoor behavior. And the thing you can currently do against this is make sure no one tampers with your hard drive, so keep control of your supply chain and keep control of who has root access to your PC. Okay, I can try to give you a demo, but the problem is that I spent really a lot of time to program this backdoor, and I still have a problem with memory corruption. I spent several days trying to figure out where it is, but I cannot find it. And yeah, so I think I will just start preparing the demo, but we can at the same time also start having questions.
Hi. Do you have any interest in contributing a tool to nsaplayset.org by any chance?
So the question was if I had interest in doing a tool. Can you repeat?
Can I interest you in contributing a tool to the NSA playset?
Yeah, why not? No, so I will not make the backdoor code available, most probably also not to the NSA, except if they already have a backdoor in my computer and got it. So, no.
I have a question here.
Yeah?
What about SSDs? Change something to use different media?
No. SSDs also have a microcontroller inside because they do quite complex operations, wear leveling and so on. So they need to have some intelligence inside. So they also have a microcontroller where you have general purpose code running, and you can infect this microcontroller and you can do the same attack on an SSD.
So it's totally regardless the way the hardware itself is managing the data of hardware. So it's your place between the operating system and the way the data is
Yeah.
stored. You just intercept the thing.
Yeah, exactly. And sorry?
I just want some clarification on the attack method where, all right, you've got the backdoor on the hard drive, and then you would send, you would cause something to be written to the hard drive, a certain pattern that your backdoor would match against?
Yes.
And then it would respond. Now, at that point, you're going to try to get an infection going on the host to communicate out across the network, or how are you actually getting the network traffic generated?
No, so in this case, I just rely on the fact that traffic from the network finally gets written to the disk, and afterwards is sent to the network again. So if you have, it's like HTML5 storage, it's cookies, it's SQL databases. Everything that comes from the network gets stored and can be retrieved afterwards again, can be used to channel information out. Of course, you have the low throughput, so if you infect the host, you can have much better communication means, but it's less stealthy.
So in Sprite TM's blog post, he happened to mention that there's quite a few microcontrollers that are being used on these. Like, there's only a few vendors, but they do use a number of different microcontrollers. I don't know if you've observed more than the specific firmware that you were reversing, but number one, are the debugging tools going to be available? And number two, is there perhaps a pattern that we could use to scan multiple firmwares that might be written for different chipsets, but in the same architecture, so that you could kind of automate the process of being able to establish your hooks rather than having to disassemble and reverse engineer the entire firmware?
So one thing after another. First, for the tool, now I'm using Avatar, and this is available. I'm also putting the profile that I use for the hard drive on the internet, so you can just check out Avatar on GitHub, and you have the code for this. Then for the different microcontrollers, I looked at Seagate drives, and Seagate drives have quite uniform firmware. They have a hardware abstraction layer below, and then the software above is quite similar across the drives. Of course, those hard drive vendors all acquired a lot of other vendors at the moment. So Seagate has Maxtor, I think, and some other vendors. And those drives still use different firmwares. But I guess they're going to get migrated to the Seagate firmware in future revisions. because it's more handy for Seagate to just maintain one software. And the last question was?
I guess the last one was, is there a series of, like, is there an assembly stub that you could detect in the firmware that might let you determine where to place your hook? So you were injecting interrupt callbacks, I guess, to...
Yeah, this is more or less the topic of my PhD, and this is what I'm looking into.
Oh, excellent. So I'll look up your website then and look forward to it. Thank you.
Is there any collection of firmware images on the internet that you could download a whole bunch of and try and do a comparison to try and figure out how varied in functionality and possibly hardware they are across the same vendor?
So first, there are several firmwares available for the same drive model depending on where you get it from, like Dell or Seagate directly or so on. You can do comparisons between those firmwares, and I tried to compare a bit also for different revisions. Like for this drive, you have one revision, and they just fixed one small bug that was causing the drive to break, and brought out a new revision. And I looked a bit to find the diff between the two. This is not very hard, but then across disks, it gets more difficult to find the difference. What is the different hardware that is used inside the disk? And right now, there are not a lot of tools available for static analysis of binary firmware. I hope this will change in the near future. But right now, if you want to do really binary analysis, I think IDA is the tool of your choice, and it's not very automatic. Okay, so can I switch to this one, to the VGA? Where? Here. Just unplug? Okay. Okay, so I really hope the demo is working. Okay, I have this file. It just contains some dummy text, but it's easy to recognize. This is going to be our secret file that we want to recover. And can you see the window? View. There we are. So this should be fine. Okay, so here, just some garbage text. And first, I write this text to a secret location, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay. Then we're just checking what data is at sector 10,000, so that you see I'm not cheating you. Wrong command. Okay. So this was the data I read from there. You can see that it's actually the backdoor command that was written there before. It's the magic sequence composed of W, X, Y, Z. And then there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 here inside, which is the backdoor command to read this sector. Okay. Then I'm writing the same again to activate the backdoor. And this is where it leaves me. Ooh. Yeah, the hard drive went away. So demo gods are not nice to me. The hard drive decided not to work. Yeah, so I'm sorry, but the demo is really flaky because I still have some memory corruption inside. I'm not able to find exactly which part of memory is not used, where in the control flow I have to hook. My backdoor works like half of the time, and I can retry. But also, I'm not paid to do a production-grade backdoor, and I have to move on to other projects. And by the way, thanks for not hacking the Wemo. Okay, yeah, this is taking a long time. Now you see Avatar running on the drive and forwarding memory requests. In the end, if I ever manage to get a stable version of the backdoor, then I can put it directly in the firmware and burn it on the drive. But again, this is not what I want to do, well, unless I get employed in the future by the NSA. Okay, so let's try again. I have already written this secret text, so I don't need to do it again. So I'm just copying again the original block. Let's just check. Okay, original block is fine. And now I'm sending the backdoor command again. And it's fine. And now I'm just reading the sector again that I had before. And it's working. And you see that it exfiltrates the sector. Okay, thank you. That's it. Bye.